Hi, wonderful humans. This is my overview of Units 1 and 2. And again, our themes for Unit 1 and 2 are global tapestry, so how is everything connected within our big world during this time period of 1200 to 1450 that you will be tested on, as well as networks of exchange. And when we talk about networks of exchange, we're not necessarily just talking about economic features, we're also talking about cultural and political features, other things that people could trade throughout the world at this time. When I am discussing Units 1 and 2, because I have mushed them together in my review, we are going to be discussing chapters 8 through 12. I'm going to be giving bigger overviews of what each section discusses, and then if you have any questions, feel free to reach out in our chat or send me an email of specifics based on whatever that topic was. So without any further ramblings, here is Chapter 8. Again, Chapter 8 really connects with Unit 2, this idea of networks of exchange, because it is talking about physical commodities that are being traded as well as religions along the Silk Sea and Sand Roads. Chapter 8, Section 1 starts off by talking about the Silk Roads, and this is where I would suggest for you to figure out as you are approaching a DBQ or when you are reading through it, if this was potentially your topic of understanding what's happening in the world during this time. So the Silk Roads really connect nicely with Chapter 9 talking about China, where many of those products originate, and so I might bring that up in my contextualization piece. Again, as I'm going through and talking about that DBQ, or if these are things that are going to be presented on the test, I might have out my cheat sheets with my annotations or practice writing some contextualizations out that I could then use for that AP test. So again, Chapter 8, Section 1 is all about the Silk Roads. The Silk Roads are going to connect from China to the Roman Empire during this time. One of the big things that we know about the Silk Roads is, yes, indeed, that silk is going to be traded along them, along with other luxury goods. This is going to be because of how trade is going to happen. And again, this is going to be using small caravans that are going to then be used in a relay system going from one person to the next. So let's say we have silk starting out in China. It's then going to go to a central oasis city and then be traded off to somebody else who's going to go to the next central oasis city and then perhaps to the Byzantine Empire and then further. Again, it's that relay system. We are only able to take a small amount of that product at a time, and it takes a while for that product to be made. That makes it a luxury good. Other luxury goods that you could talk about being made during this time would be things such as porcelain, salt, and tea. Again, a lot of these products are going to originate from China because they're going through their golden age, which we'll talk about with Chapter 9 in a second. Besides luxury goods that are traded in China during this time, you are also going to see the trade of two other things. You're going to see the trade of religion. Specifically, when we talk about Buddhism, it's first going to be traded from India to China via merchants, and then eventually again through those central oasis cities and into Southeast Asia. And the second thing that you are going to see traded during this time is disease. Specifically, when we talk about the bubonic plague, again, we really love that relay system that's been happening, or that is capable because of the nomads, but a downfall is going to be that even those who maybe don't have or appear to have symptoms could still be carriers of diseases, and thus you are going to see about 1/3 of Europe who is going to be devastated by this bubonic plague, in addition to many others in China and along the way. So again, those are really our things that are being traded: luxury goods, religion, specifically Buddhism, and the bubonic plague along the Silk Roads. Chapter 8, Section 2 is then going to talk about an opposite type of good, bulk goods that are traded along the sea roads. The sea roads are mainly going to be that Indian Ocean trade network in addition to the Mediterranean. And here you're going to see the trade of bulk goods because ships are allowed to carry more during this time. In addition to carrying more during this time, we have ships who have discovered or have new technologies such as the compass and the lateen sail, which allows them to navigate through those monsoon winds in the Indian Ocean. This was not something that previously happened before, and so this is going to again allow a new type of development. You're going to see port cities that are going to grow in India, specifically the southern portions of India, as well as along the eastern coasts of Africa and in Southeast Asia. So again, we're going to see the growth of port cities, the trading of bulk goods, and new technology that allows all of this to happen. In addition to that, when we talk about religion being traded, you're going to see several different religions. The main one that we talked about in class was Islam, and how Islam is going to be traded to the eastern coast of Africa and then with the interiors. However, you're also going to see a heavy influence of Hinduism and Buddhism that is spread throughout Southeast Asia as well. This is why many of our islands, when the Europeans come over later, are going to have those influences again of Islam, Hinduism, and Buddhism. Some examples that you could discuss or talk about with this would be the kingdom of Srivijaya, which is going to be associated with Buddhism during this time. You could also talk about Java, which is going to be associated with Hinduism and Buddhism during this time, as well as, like I said, when Islam is later going to be an influence in both of these places. Some of the goods that you would associate with the sea trade are going to, again, be those bulk goods. Spices are going to be the main thing, and again, spices are really important. They're going to be traded into those port cities that are associated with Islam and the Islamic empires, and then traded over to Europe, which then starts later on our age of exploration. You're also going to see other goods such as ivory and minerals that are going to come from Africa and help out. The last type of road that we talked about was the sand roads. The sand roads are mainly going to be from the Middle East throughout the northern portions of the Sahara Desert or throughout Africa into the west coast of Africa. This is really important because prior to this, the west coast of Africa were divided into those smaller tribes, and now you are going to see the creation of urban centers mainly for trade because of the sand roads. Goods that are going to be traded along the sand roads are mainly going to be through small camel caravans, and so you're going to see the trade of gold in particular, copper, salt, ivory, and you will have small amounts of slaves that are being traded during this time as well. Again, camels are really important because this was really the first time that Western Africa got to connect with the rest of the world in trade, because they were able to survive, those camels were able to survive without water for a really long time. You're also going to see, again, trade of religion, really important because a lot of these merchants are coming from the Middle East. You're going to see a lot of Muslim influence then in Western Africa, and we're going to talk later about that in terms of madrasas, or those schools of education in particular. Remember that when we've talked about Islam in the past, Islam is seen as a sign of wealth, okay? Merchants are associated with wealth due to Muhammad, and thus you're going to see a high conversion rate, specifically among those urban elites within Western Africa. And so really this is where you are going to see your empires of Ghana and Mali and the Songhay that are going to rise. That is pretty much all of Chapter 8. We also very briefly discussed or talked about how Chapter 8 has a very small portion that talks about the American trade network. Please just recognize that even though our tribes, when Europeans come over to the New World, do not seem as advanced, that they are still trading or have those networks of exchange. We can see evidence of that all the way from the southern portions of Peru up to what we would consider the Pueblo in modern day Arizona. So again, our Native American tribes are trading during this time, despite the types of technology that they are going to have later on. I'm then going to move on to Chapter 9. Again, if you have any questions, feel free to reach out to me, send me a message, or you can send me an email as well. So Chapter 9, again, is all about this idea of the global tapestry, or how does China fit into this bigger picture of trade. We've already talked about how China is going to be very successful in terms of silk, but recognizing that this is really China's time of what we would consider their golden age, or peace and prosperity. So we talked about how, and again, this is before the time period you would be tested on in the actual test, is the Sui Dynasty, and the Sui Dynasty is going to reunify China because the dynasty before them had Confucianism. Confucianism is discredited during this time. The Sui Dynasty brings about Buddhism, again, brought by the Silk Roads from India, And then you're going to see elements of Buddhism that are also practiced in the Tang Dynasty, which then comes after. So the Sui Dynasty is very short-lived. Tang Dynasty is much, much longer. And then after the Tang Dynasty is going to be our Song Dynasty. So Sui, Tang, Song. And each of these dynasties, again, is really going to help influence that golden age or a time of peace and prosperity. The Tang Dynasty, because they do have Buddhism, you'll see more equality for women, as well as greater acceptance for outsiders. So again, nomads outside of China. Although you will see some elements of Chinese education as well as the Chinese government that continue on. So here we're still going to have your state ministries. You'll have some sort of government surveillance, which they call their censorate during this time, in addition to that civil service exam. So those are all elements of Chinese government and education that stay despite no longer practicing Confucianism under the Tang Dynasty. In addition, the government is going to show their power or continue with their power by redistributing much of that land that the peasants worked on to landowners, and then those landowners are going to maintain power over that land. This is not going to make the peasants happy, which is going to cause some tensions between, again, those peasants and the government system. When we talk about the Golden Age, again, remember we just got done talking about the Tang Dynasty, but we're also going to talk about the Song Dynasty. The Song Dynasty is one who is going to go from Buddhism and slowly make their way back into those Confucian teachings. When they do this, they're going to blend a lot of those elements of Buddhism with Confucianism and another way of life or religion that we are going to call Taoism. This is what then leads to NeoConfucianism. So again, NeoConfucianism is the blending of Taoism, Confucianism, and Buddhism. It's mainly going to have elements of Confucianism. So again, you're going to see a lot of those tight patriarchal restrictions. You're going to see a heavy emphasis on family values, education, as well as service to the government during this time. And so that's really where your Song Dynasty comes into play. The Song Dynasty is also going to be a part of this economic revolution because it is, this economic golden age, because you are going to see new inventions as well, such as gunpowder. Salt is going to become really important, the compass, that are going to help people then spread those inventions westward towards the Byzantine Empire. Because the Song Dynasty has emphasized Confucianism again, you are going to see patriarchy, with an example being foot binding. And like I said before, this is really where we start to emphasize or discuss the idea of Neo-Confucianism. So Neo-Confucianism. Because our Chinese dynasties are not on the defensive or trying to push other foreigners out, we are going to see that they are expanding during this time. The three main pieces we talked about in our notes were Korea, Vietnam, and Japan. When we talked about Japan, we talked a lot about selective borrowing, how the Japanese are going to send people over to China during this time to study and then borrow from there. Some of the things we are going to see is Buddhism, although it's not going to replace the Shinto religion, as well as some sort of local military force, as well as bureaucratic practices within their government system. Korea is going to be the only one, Korea is going to resist being conquered by the Chinese, although they will still have heavy influence in terms of Buddhism, although that really only spreads among the elites. And you are going to see a lot of emphasis on court life and culture via what the Chinese had practiced during this time. Vietnam is really the one that is going to have a heavy that China is going to have a heavy influence on, because they are the only ones who are completely conquered during this time. You are going to see a lot of the elites who are going to assimilate during this time in hopes to help with their ruling as well as their lives. And you are going to see the government who's going to adapt, again, parts of that bureaucratic system, but also the civil service exam. This would also be a good trade or a good influence in China, because China is going to gain rice from this, which we will then know that China is going to use throughout the next few, or that they are going to use from then on as a type of food source. So again, the emphasis here with China is that while they had this time of peace and prosperity, that they are also going to be gaining goods from other people. So there's a lot of interactions and exchanges that are happening with China. The next place I would like to discuss is in Chapter 10, which is Europe. Chapter 10 is going to give you a lot of background information about things that you do not need to know for the test. However, these would be great things if you want to talk in terms of contextualization or talking about like why is Europe the way that it is when it starts in 1200. So if you get a DBQ that's talking about feudalism in Western Europe or the Byzantine Empire, these would be all things that you could then use for contextualization or talking about like why in the world did Europe end up this way. So just quick recap, we briefly talked about the Roman Empire and how it's going to fall in 476. When it falls in 476, the Byzantine Empire is going to take over the eastern portions of Europe, while the Western European portion remains very fragmented, or what we are going to call our feudal states during this time. The Byzantine Empire is going to be based around or centralized around modern-day Istanbul, or what used to be Constantinople or Byzantium. And there again, it's going to be centralized. You are going to see a really strong government with a good taxation system during this time. Because they have a lot of water that is surrounding them in Byzantium, it's also really easy to defend, which makes it a great place for this kingdom to grow. In addition, they are centralized between Western Europe and all of Asia, that they are also able to trade and flourish in that manner. So again, the Byzantine Empire really has a lot going for them after the fall of the Roman Empire. We'd also associate the Byzantine Empire with Christianity, specifically the Eastern Orthodox Christianity. When we talk about Western Europe during this time, from that 500 to 1000 time period, we're talking about Western Europe being very backwards, or fitting that name of the Dark Ages. Western Europe is going to be very, very fragmented, and this is where we discussed or talked about that triangle in class, where you have one pope who is at the top from the Roman Catholic Church. You have kings who are going to be underneath this pope and ultimately need that pope to support them. Remember, this is going to come into play later. You are going to then have nobles, knights, and serfs. Those last three groups, the nobles, knights, and serfs, have a very unique relationship with one another. The nobles are going to own that land in which the knights have to protect, and the serfs are then going to work on. The serfs are going to then in exchange get that protection of the knights if anyone is going to come in and conquer that manor or conquer that land, as well as the serfs are then going to give whatever food is or whatever product is made on that land back to those nobles then. So again, this is the idea of feudalism, and you would associate this with manors as well. What would then happen is a king could go and conquer another kingdom or another manor. When he did that, any of the knights or serfs that were tied to that land are then going to go to that king. This is how people such as Charlemagne were able to grow their empire during the 8th century and so on. And so that's really how Europe or Western Europe looks prior to that 1000 time. Once you start to see more and more kings who grow larger kingdoms, this is really where Western Europe starts to take hold and become less fragmented and more centralized, and then moving into those modern states by the time we hit 1450 that you and I would recognize today, such as Spain, Portugal, Great Britain. We'll even see the starts of France during this time. So that is what we would consider the eastern and western portions of Europe. The last thing I wanted to go through, and I forgot about this, was the Crusades. And this is really where we see Western Europe continuing to grow, is that during the 1200s that the Crusades are going to occur. When the Crusades occur, remember that this is really where the Pope is giving his authority to the rest of Western Europe, asking for those knights to go and take over, conquer the Middle East again. And they really want to take it from those Islamic empires who had been living there. They wanted to take back that Holy Land. It's ultimately going to hurt the Byzantine Empire, who we would almost see as like a Christian buffer between Western Europe and the Islamic empires, and thus leads partially to the downfall of the Byzantine Empire in the 1400s. The Crusades do not gain anything land-wise for the Western Europeans, and we did talk a little bit about how this is going to hurt them in terms of population as well. So that's really where the Crusades come into play, as well as chapter 10. We then move on to chapter 11. Chapter 11 is going to deal again a lot with what's happening in the Islamic empires prior to the time period you'll be tested on, which is 1200. It starts off by talking about how in the world Islam is going to grow. You'd associate it with Muhammad, the revelations that he is going to have written down in the Quran, as well as trying to gain a following in Mecca, then to Medina, then back to Mecca. With that being said, keeping in mind that once this is all done, that we are going to, after Muhammad passes, see the 4 rightly guided caliphs. The 4 rightly guided caliphs are people who have studied under Muhammad as well as are related to him in some way, shape, or form, and so they follow all formats that both Sunni and Shia Muslims would want. However, after the 4 rightly guided caliphs is where that split is going to occur. So you'll have Sunni Muslims who wish to break away, and this is going to be a majority population during this time as well as modern day. Your Sunni Muslims are going to be those who believe that it could technically be anyone within the Islamic Empire as long as they are people who are considered educated under Islamic law, or in Islamic law and teachings. And then you have the Shia who are going to say that your ruler should be somebody who is going to be a blood relative of Muhammad. So again, that's the difference between Sunni and Shia. When we talk specifically about like the Ottoman Empire is going to be known for being a Sunni Muslim group, whereas when we talk about groups such as the Safavids, they are going to be a Shia Muslim group. Chapter 11 is going to mainly deal with and talk about expansion of Islam during that 1200 to 1450 time period, but also again trickling into times before from that 700 mark. It's going to deal with things such as people who do not want to pay the non-Muslim tax, the jizya tax. We can talk about social conversion during this time. You could also talk about how people saw how successful the Islamic Empire was in terms of conquering all these other places in the world under the Abbasid Empire, that they then decided to convert, thinking, well, if their God is so awesome and great that they can expand this much and be so successful, why would we also not worship this God? And so you're going to see conversion that way as well. The last way you're going to see conversion is people who have decided, and usually this happens alongside the jizya tax in places such as the Middle East moving into the Byzantine Empire, was they saw a lot of similar ideas in terms of monotheism or being an Abrahamic religion with Judaism and Christianity that they then converted from there. As we talk about the Islamic Empire, we talked about how the Islamic Empire is going to have an impact really in 4 places. In chapter 11, we talk about how it's going to have an impact in Spain, in Anatolia, or what we would consider modern-day Turkey, India, and then also Western Africa. Because I already talked about Western Africa when we talked about the sand roads, I'm not really going to go through that again, but recognizing that it has a huge impact among the elites, and then it's re-emphasized through the building of mosques and madrasas in West Africa. As we talk about Islam in Spain, we're really focusing on Islam in Spain coming, and it is very, very tolerant at first. In fact, these are the Muslims are the people who are going to rule in Spain very briefly. However, once it becomes non-tolerant, you're going to see that clash of the Christians and the Muslims, specifically the Roman Catholics and the Muslims. And then eventually by 1492, the Muslims are going to be pushed out of Spain. So again, some conversion, but we would say not a high-lasting conversion in Spain due to that intolerance of others. When we talk about India, we would say that India has some success in converting people to Islam. Again, it's about 20 to 25% of people who are going to be converted to Islam during this time. And when I say that's considered successful, is because you already have a large number of people who have Hinduism integrated into their everyday life in India. And so it's really either coming and blending Islam into their already established religion, or some of those people who were Buddhist or of lower castes that are then going to convert to the Islamic religion. This is the start of our Mughal Empire, which we'll then talk about more in the next unit. The last place I want to discuss is Anatolia. And again, Anatolia, or modern-day Turkey, is much of what we know as the Byzantine Empire. When the Byzantine Empire falls, this is where we're going to see a lot of conversion, with about 90% by the 1500s. And this would really be the place where Islam is going to stick around the most. This is where you are going to then see the creation of the Ottoman Empire as well. So again, Ottoman Empire there. That's pretty much all I have for chapter 11. I'm quickly going to move on to chapter 12 and just give an overview, and then we're all done. Chapter 12 is, again, talking about how are the Mongols connected in terms of trade networks, as well as the global tapestry. Like, where do they fit into all of this? And the Mongols are at that perfect time point that you start getting tested on, because it's that 1200 to 1450 time period, and really 1200 to 1400, that the Mongols have their greatest success, or their empire. The person that you would associate the most is Genghis Khan, or Chenghis Khan, with this empire. And how he allows this empire to grow is really by success of how he rules. So again, he has a very well-organized and disciplined army during this time. We talked about how he has the groups managed in terms of tens, 100s, 1000s, as well as disciplined in terms of if somebody was going to desert their group, that their entire group was going to be executed. You could also talk about in terms of when they went and conquered other people, if there was outright refusal, they would also kill off those people. So they were seen as a brutal force, but also a group that people really decided not to go against for those reasons. We also talked about how they would take people from different areas that they conquered and then spread them out over their entire empire depending on their needs, in addition to separating families as well as cities that they conquered from one another in hopes to push down rebellions. 3 places that your textbook talked about that you could use as examples of where the Mongols are going to go are Persia, China, and Russia. When the Mongols go to Persia, it's a complete wipeout of Persia, or very brutal attacks in Persia due to some pushback from the Persian Empire, specifically the Abbasid Caliphate during this time. And so then you're going to see the Mongols, who are going to take over and rule in Persia, adopting actually a lot of their cultural elements. So you're going to see the Persian bureaucracy that is still used. You're going to see agriculture, as well as Muslim practices. And then eventually when the Mongols are pushed out or defeated, they really just kind of integrate into that lifestyle of the Persians, or blend in by the early 1300s. China, you're going to see a very violent takeover of the northern portions, but by the time they get to the south, they are going to have less violence, and really it's going to be more accommodating to those locals who are there. Again, they're going to associate themselves with some of Chinese life or some of Chinese culture, but still remaining true to their values as well. The Mongols are going to leave China in the mid to late 1300s. And again, once they are pushed out, that's really where the Chinese come in and say no more foreign rule. And they're going to go back to Ming Dynasty and some of those truer traditional values of China. The last place that we talked about China ruling during this time, the Mongols ruling during this time, is Russia, and we really said this was a rule from afar. They didn't see the Russians as having many goods that they wanted or saw as valuable, specifically along those trade networks. And so instead, whenever they needed something, they would go into those Russian cities, ask for those tributes, and then live on those outskirts. Because of this and not having like a true takeover in Russia, as well as remaining truly nomadic during this time, you're not going to see a complete push out of the Mongols by the Russians until the 1500s. With that being said, that's really all I have for you for today. Again, if you have any questions, feel free to reach out either on WebEx or email. Units 1 and 2, if you were given a DBQ on this, the main things I would focus on is talking about how all of these places in Afro-Eurasia are now connected together through trade, the Silk Sea and Sand Roads, but also through other networks of exchange, or not necessarily just by commodities. In addition, understanding where everyone fits into that global tapestry, or where everyone fits into this world network, and recognizing that even though we didn't talk about them a ton, that Western Europe as well as the Americas are also trading as well as existing during this time period, and what that looks like. Thanks for listening. Have a great day.